On time, and I'm Phil Wilcox, the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and we are very proud and lucky, together with the Middle East Institute, our host here, to have a very special program. Many of our programs here, most of our visitors usually leave less encouraged than when they arrive. I'm sorry to say, but that's not true today.
We'll rectify that, yeah.
And you're going to give us a very different kind of presentation. So we're just very happy to have you here. The book which you have seen here it's an extraordinary book. It's not just a cookbook. So I welcome you to have a good look at it and take home a copy or two. It's published by Just World Press, which is an innovative and very successful young publishing company down in Charlottesville, led by Helena Cobbin. Layla Al-Haddad is a Gazan by heritage. Her parents were both Gazans. She was born in Kuwait, and she has had a long and deep experience in Gaza, for the most part in reporting with Al Jazeera English, The Guardian, and for many other publications around the world. Maggie Schmidt is a Harvard graduate and a Middle East expert who has spent lots of time in the region. She got interested in Gazan cooking when she was assigned by The Atlantic to do a short piece on eating under siege. And she and Layla met in 2010 in Gaza, and together they created this wonderful Gaza kitchen, a Palestinian culinary journey. Gazans, as you know, live in a kind of ancient crossroads of the Middle East. Gaza has a rich traditional culture and a more modern culture as well, which has been enriched further by Palestinian refugees from all over Palestine. And what is little known and underappreciated, as it was put by a famous French food critic, Anthony Bourdain, is that Gazan cuisine is something very special, especially very unique, but virtually unknown. Now you have repaired that problem with this book, and I gather that the two of you have been out on the hustings for a long time, talking about the book to very receptive audiences and critiques in the food press and the mainstream press. So we're grateful that you could take some time to speak to us. Gaza is sometimes, unfortunately, viewed by people who have never been there as a kind of sink of despair and misery. Those who have visited Gaza realize that it is a very lively and dynamic society, which has endured terrible adversity over the years, but nevertheless it is it's quite a stimulating place, and as are its people and its cuisine. Food, as you know, is the center of family life, and if you start with the study of food, it takes you into agriculture, economics, and society. So this is not just a book of 130 great recipes. Incidentally, I'm not a cook, but I use cookbooks sometimes, and this is one you can understand. And it does not require ingredients that are available only in Gaza. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll listen with great interest and fascination about your adventure in writing this book about the food and the cuisine, and the larger aspect that you cover in your book. So
thank you very much, Phil. Thank you.
Can we get a sense of the time? How does this work?
Well, let's take about 1 hour.
Okay.
And we'll have time. You tell us, how much time would you like to leave for questions?
It's really up to you. We'd
like to have as much dialogue as possible.
Exactly.
So would you like to do that during your talk, or shall we set aside 20 minutes at the end.
Sure,
Do
yeah,
questions.
let's do that.
Yeah.
Do questions at the end.
We probably
Good.
won't talk for an
Okay.
hour. though.
No, I don't think so. Great. Well, thank you, Phil, for presenting us. Many thanks to the Middle East Institute for having us here.
Disappeared our.
And let's see if we can get this back. Yeah, okay. So, again, thank you. When we first started talking about, maybe we should tell the process first,
Okay.
how this,
Yeah, I
how
don't
this
know why
came
this
to be.
keeps happening.
Basically, we
Hang
give
on one
very
second.
informal presentations in which we interrupt each other, and then we invite the audience to interrupt us. So make yourself comfortable, and we're not too formal.
Yeah, the process.
Yeah.
Sure. You heard a little bit about it in the introduction, but essentially, food is of interest to both of us. But of course, as you heard, this is more than just food. This book is about more than just food. I myself, as you heard, am a Palestinian. I grew up in the Gulf, but then I would commute between Palestine, between Gaza and the Gulf as a child. And food was always this sort of, Palestinian food was always sort of this mystery to me, because it was at a time during the 80s when our identity was very much, our existence was very much in question and always threatened. And remember, at that time, this was before 1988, Palestine wasn't recognized as a word. You wouldn't find it anywhere. And we were always kind of under the guise of other identities. So I felt like food was this one thing we could kind of hang on to that could verify and identify us and locate us where maps and atlases failed to do so. That kind of was the beginning of my fascination with food. And somewhere along the way, when I ended up back in Gaza and I was working there as a journalist, I started my blog, and I would frequently post recipes very specific to the Gaza region, which were virtually unheard of, not just to the world, but to other Palestinians in the West Bank, in the 48 territories outside of Palestine. And this, of course, speaks to Gaza's isolation, its long-term isolation and closure, not just recently, but long before. In 2009, fast forward 2009, Maggie had then visited Gaza and on a citizen diplomacy tour, and was subsequently writing an article using food as kind of the narrative device. And in the course of her research, came across nothing, just as I did, beyond a few articles that I had written. So she got in touch with me, and in the course of our conversation, the idea of working on something bigger, on a book about this subject, really appealed to us. But we kind of tabled the proposition because this was the height of the blockade in 2009, as you recall. And I said, you know, you never know. Things have a tendency to change overnight. Let's just wait and see. And sure enough, in May 2010, there was the attack on the Mavi Marmara, which has now re-entered the news, as you probably heard. The borders opened ever so briefly, the Rafah crossing, which is the only land crossing for Palestinians into Gaza. So I said, let's do it. So I literally just booked the ticket. I hadn't been there in 3 years. Took my 2 kids with me, flew to Cairo, traveled 5 hours to the border crossing, and then I met Maggie there. It took her a little bit longer, about two more weeks, and we just hit the ground running. And we spent about 8 weeks of the most intensive field research that we've ever done, and we can talk a little bit more about what that was like as well.
So when we first started talking about doing a Gaza cookbook, people in general outside of Gaza and in the States and elsewhere, it produced a sort of cognitive dissonance. Like, Gaza, this besieged, embattled place, you're going to write a cookbook? Isn't that a little bit frivolous? Isn't that a little bit absurd? On the one hand, or on the other hand, but in Gaza everyone's starving. How can you write a cookbook? It's almost insulting. In short, the media images that we see of Gaza are basically like this. They're anonymous, they're external, they're from above, they're subject to the ravages of violence. Gaza, we again and again see represented either as this sort of terrifying villain and cruel aggressor, or as this hapless victim and sort of helpless object of abuse. Whether from one side or the other of the political spectrum, what we never see represented of Gaza are its intimate spaces, its daily life, its the fact that human beings there are conducting normal lives sort of like anywhere else. So our hope was to sort of zoom in through any one of those windows of the typical media representation of Gaza and get into the inside and look at daily life where war and blockade and the sort of big political issues are constantly present, but almost as a background noise to family life, to household economies, and to the sort of daily business of survival. As we were doing this, we were a little bit nervous about how are we going to get into household. We set out to do a sort of a three-pronged research. We decided that we wanted to document the recipes, because as Leila said, Gaza has a very peculiar, very interesting, very unique cuisine, somehow related to the broader Levantine food environment, but very peculiar, and using spices and tastes that are not present elsewhere, and which have never been documented before because, as Leila said, of the closure and isolation of Gaza. So on the one hand, we had this sort of heritage collection documentation interest in simply collecting and compiling and writing down those recipes. Second, we wanted to, like I said, give a sort of a sense of daily life, intimate space, this siege and the whole situation seen from sort of from out the kitchen window, because we all know that a lot more happens in the kitchen than just the recipes. Kitchens are where families converge, stories get told, histories get related, so we wanted to capture a little bit of that intimate space and share it. So we also wanted to do character profiles. So the book you'll find has recipes, has character profiles of individuals telling little fragments of their own sort of personal life histories and reflecting on things. And then, as Phil said in his lovely introduction, we felt like food was this really key tool for starting from the minuscule, starting from households, from largely women's space, from very sort of quotidian, mundane details, and then following the threads that connect those households to the larger economy, to the larger political situation, to the ecological system, to the economy. And so we follow the questions of pricing, whether fuel is available, what ingredients are available, which ones are not, etc., sort of out the concentric circles to a bigger political and economic situation. So we also interviewed agronomists, economists, nutritionists, aid workers, etc., to get a sense of how the larger food system works in Gaza, because we felt like the food system was sort of a key to understanding the whole political situation there, but from a very, very different angle than the usual one.
It's what's some have called a subversive strategy for a cookbook. So you think you're getting a cookbook, but
Right.
For those who want one, you do. But then you also get so much more. You're actually learning.
Yeah, it's very much right now in the U.S. Everybody wants to talk about food. Everybody wants to eat everything. Everybody wants to eat the whole world through their foods, but mostly nobody wants to talk very much about Palestine. So it was kind of, as Leila says, a little backdoor trick. Start out talking about food, and before you know it, we're talking about everything else.
Yeah. Maybe just we'll talk a little about this map, and we sometimes get the question, why Gaza, or why did you choose to focus on Gaza? I mean, the short answer is it was beyond our scope to focus on all of Palestine. We were working with a two-woman team, and then eventually one layout person and a $6,000 budget. So you can get a sense of why we couldn't do all of Palestine. But beyond that, really, like Maggie was saying, it is a region that has real peculiarities in regards to the cuisine that tells you a little bit about its historic position as a crossroads. And here you can see the book, what we choose to focus on isn't simply the modern-day Gaza Strip, but was once known as the historic Gaza District, which was a mandate under the Ottomans and then the British. And really this entire region shares kind of one culinary heritage, up to Jaffa, down to Bir Sabah, Beersheba. And then what happens, of course, in 1948, these Palestinians are expelled from their homes and end up in what would then become the Gaza Strip before the borders were drawn. And so the modern-day Gaza Strip is overwhelmingly made up, something like 80% of the residents are refugees who are not from the Gaza Strip, but are from these surrounding towns and villages, and also from Yafa and Bir al-Sabah. And so we really wanted to, and it makes it a very, then why Gaza? It makes it a very unique place to encounter the culinary traditions of all of this region, are kind of all lumped in to one inside the modern-day Gaza Strip.
One of the things we were continually surprised by doing the field research was how incredibly local kitchens, cooking habits are. Any given family will cook, maybe they'll cook some dishes that have been influenced by their neighbors and friends, but hugely they cooked dishes which are specifically from their home village. And this is after 65 years of exile. This is into the second and third and fourth and fifth generation of exile. And still, as Leila said before, there's this interest in locating themselves on the map. And so for us, it became this sort of ghost archaeology of there may not be a single stone left of some of these villages in the 48 lands of Hamama or of Beit Jirja or of these other villages that are no longer on the map, but you can still taste them, and they're still alive in the gestures of the kitchen and this sort of food heritage that's passed from one family, from one generation to the next. And we found that fascinating, both in terms of the sort of nostalgia and devotion to this memory that it represents, and sort of sociologically the endogamic habits of these families, that they continue to marry within their village in order to maintain those cooking habits and those sort of village identities intact, even living in an urban refugee camp or scattered throughout the Gaza Strip.
I mean, just as a small example of what Maggie was referring to, you know, you can see how small, you know, modern-day Gaza is, and even in an area this small, we would speak to someone, for example, from Gaza City, who would make a very traditional dish called sumagiya, which is a lamb, sumac, right, a sumac-infused lamb stew. And then we would speak to someone, for example, who lives in the Deir al-Balah refugee camp. You see how close that is. It's about 15 minutes away by car. And because she, you know, I'm referring to one woman we interviewed, her name is Ibrahim, who's like a 90-year-old, an incredible woman from the village of Beit Tima on the eastern borders of Gaza. I think it was there on the map somewhere. But anyway, 15 minutes apart, and she, you know, she would say to us, "Oh, so Magia, I have no idea how to, I mean, that's a Gaza City dish. I mean, who knows?" And you know, this is her as a first-generation refugee, but then this equally applied to third and fourth-generation refugees as well, from Khan Yunis, from Deir al-Balah, from all over, from Beit Lahi. Like, we don't know, that's a Khan Yunis dish, or that's a Beit Lahi dish. You know, they like to put chilies in Gaza, but we don't. You know, we only like onion, no garlic. So this was really, really fascinating to us as well. And then I don't know if you want to backtrack and talk about.
So backtracking a little bit, we were concerned when we started this fieldwork. Like I said, going into families, our methodology was going into families' homes, spending the whole afternoon talking with them, telling stories, doing a sort of life story interview at the same time as we cooked different dishes, asked them about recipes, etc. It was really wonderful, delightful, delicious fieldwork to do. And we were anxious at first about who's going to let us into their home, who's going to divulge all of these family stories to us. The answer was everyone. In Gaza, Gaza is not only politically and economically besieged, it's totally besieged by journalists. It's fraught with journalists. And every time anybody sees a foreigner with a camera approaching, they sort of brace themselves to give the official talk about the borders, the siege, the tunnels, the situation, no? And so when we approached and they were sort of readying themselves to tell us about the situation, we said, no, tell us about lentils. How do you make lentils? How did your grandmother make lentils? They were completely unhorsed. They were sort of stuck for a moment, and then they were thrilled, and then they were delighted. And we had people falling all over themselves. You know, someone would overhear us asking about lentils, and then heads would pop out from the adjoining
crowd around us.
Did you say? And they would also want to tell us.
It wasn't like it was just one specific group, you know.
Everyone wanted to tell us about, because food, and this was a sort of a confirmation of our initial intuition about this field research. People love to talk about food. People are proud of their food. Food is the source of identity. Food is a sort of common ground outside of all of the painful things to talk about. Food is this constant source of joy, of identity, of a place where pleasure is found even when things are otherwise so grim. So so yeah, the field research proved so much easier than we could possibly have imagined, as everyone dragged us into their homes to, and then to the neighbor, and then to the other neighbor, and in the end we had way more informants than we could possibly include in the book, and really the hardest part of creating the book was cutting away, because initially we had a manuscript about 4 times longer than the book we were ultimately able to print. So so it was an incredible flood of generosity and enthusiasm, confirming our initial intuition that food was a great starting point, a sort of a thread to pull on. Also, it was important for us to document the book. Also, you'll find, has a lot of photography, and a lot of the photography got left out again because of the sort of publishing constraints and printing constraints, but it was important to us to document the totally mundane. I have a lot of photographs of how people stack their dishes in their sink, or how sort of the goings on in the markets, the goings on in the household. These seem sort of trivial, but we never see representation. Everywhere in the world, everyone knows what a supposedly average American household looks like because they see it on TV all the time. But for Americans, no one can even begin to imagine what, for example, a Gazan household looks like, how they stack their dishes in the sink, these kinds of mundane details. And again, in terms of the sort of broader political ambition of this book, at the end of the day, it's a cookbook. We don't imagine we're going to change the world with it, but if we can contribute a little bit to people attaining a vision of this place and these people as human beings, as having an ordinary life, as living the daily quotidian textures of human life, then that's at least a start in making them more difficult to bomb and more difficult to
kind of narrating Gaza in a different way than we're accustomed to. Do you want to talk about the map, or do you want to go to the...
let's talk about
So
the map.
maybe we'll talk a little bit about the map just to kind of orient. I never know with the audience is who's very familiar and who's not, but I sometimes get ahead of ourselves, and then we forget to explain where is Gaza relative to the West Bank, to Israel, to Egypt, because it's a sort of abstraction in our minds, and we forget just how closed off it is. Even people who are really intimately familiar will often tell me, oh, would you like fly to Gaza, or can you go to the West Bank, or, no. So, here you can see this is the modern-day Gaza Strip that after Israel disengaged in 2005 and dismantled the settlements that were within Gaza, retained control over the Gaza Strip through its control over the airspace, through the control over the maritime access, the sea, through control over all the commercial crossings, and the population registry, and the taxation system. So all of this essentially means that, in the end of the day, Israel controls Gaza. Even through the Rafah crossing, the principles that govern who can use Rafah are still Israeli principles. You have to have an Israeli-approved ID card called a Hawiyah. So basically, there is a ban on the movement of both people and goods in and out of Gaza. And this relates directly as we begin to talk more and more about the food system and what things can get in and what things can get out. Essentially, nothing can get out right now. And whatever does come in is ultimately determined by Israel, by Israeli surpluses in the markets. Gaza is considered what one economist, Omar Shaban, called, is it Israel's
Kitchen garden.
Kitchen garden. So you have a surplus of persimmons 1 week, they all get dumped on Gaza. Or, there's suddenly the new big thing in Israel is like galangal root, which was the case in 2010. Suddenly you're finding it in all the local spice vendors and people have no idea what to do with it. It's not as though you can request something and say, we'd like this to come in this week. That's just, and when we were there, the list was really absurd of the things that were allowed in and out under the blockade. Like at that time in 2010, it was pasta and lentils weren't allowed in. 1 week it was coriander, the next week it was ginger, pencils, computers.
These things identified as major security risks. So 1 week bananas would be a huge security risk,
Right.
and the next week bananas were okay. So it's really quite surreal. And you can read these lists and find out what are the security risks each week.
Right, and but anyway, and that list fluctuates. And right now, the major things that are still not allowed in are components for factories, to rebuild the factories, fertilizers, things like this. And we can talk a little bit more about the impact of blockade a little bit later. But just for the purposes of the map, it's important to note here that the limit on the fishing, the fishermen, Oslo restricted the fishing zone to 20 nautical miles. And that has been reducing ever since, down to 12, down to 8, down to 6, and now it's gone back to 3 nautical miles in the past few days. So that's well below the 9 nautical mile limit where the deep sea channel begins and where the real fishing happens. So essentially you have fishermen culling the smaller fish, threatening future populations, fishing in polluted waters here in central Gaza because the wastewater management facility has not been rebuilt. So that's the case with the fishing. And then the pink and the red lines you see there are what are referred to as the buffer zone or the no-go zone. That has also been encroaching into Palestinian land more and more each year, and that was set up after the 2005 disengagement. That comprises about half of Gaza's arable farmland and has essentially also been completely razed or is out of use because farmers can't access that farmland. And this buffer zone juts in as much as 1 kilometer into Gaza at any given point.
And to insist, one of the most taxing aspects of Gazans' daily life is just the total unpredictability of the situation.
Yes, yeah.
So this buffer zone may at some point be 200 meters, and then suddenly it's 600, and then suddenly it's 800, and it's unilaterally and de facto imposed from one day to the next. So farmers who have land in the eastern villages, this is one of the major agricultural areas, may plant, irrigate, at great effort because it's extremely difficult to bring in irrigation supplies, fertilizers, etc. But at great expense to themselves and effort, they may plant and prepare a whole year's worth of cultivation in one of these fields, only to find that the no-go zone has suddenly expanded, and then they can't access those fields to harvest them. So it's the sort of constant uncertainty and volatility of the situation that is perhaps both economically and psychologically really taxing upon the population.
And this is a good example. We'll give you 2 examples of that. This farmer, Mohammed Sultan, that we profile in the book, we met him at a workshop run by the Union of Agricultural Work Committees in Beit Lahia in northern Gaza. And he was there to learn either new agricultural methods or to try to get some new skills to learn what he could replant, because his farm in northern Gaza there that you saw was in the buffer zone and was completely razed to the ground, along with something like 30 beehives, and he had to make the difficult decision of choosing whether he wants to replant these rain-fed trees like the ones that he had, citrus, olive, almond, that take years to become fruitful, or plant cash crops, or plant like sort of vegetables, horticulture. And ultimately he decided to replant his trees.
But of course, a tree, I mean, in Gaza, again, every person you meet, every product you start to investigate leads to a story, and then another story, and then another story. And, for example, Gaza has one of the absolute sort of countdown crises in Gaza is the water. Gaza has historically very strong underground aquifers, but they've been so overdrawn both by the Israeli settlements, which were directly on top of the aquifers and were doing intensive hydroponics and horticulture until 2005, and then they withdrew. And then there's been this period of, because of the governance situation in Gaza, which is a whole other can of worms which we can talk about, there's no possibility, or there's very little possibility, to centrally control who's digging irrigation wells. So there are irrigation wells all over the place. It's very difficult to centralize control over them. And so the aquifer is being overdrawn very quickly, and you're right next to the sea. Saline water is entering, and that's the sort of Armageddon countdown for Gaza. So for a farmer like Mohammed Sultan, there's this question. On the one hand, he knows, and everyone kind of knows, that ideally Gaza should be growing rain-fed crops that don't require irrigation, but they take 15, 20 years to actually provide a harvest that his family of 10 could live on. if he plants short-term horticulture, he'll have a harvest this year, but it will require irrigation, which requires a whole series of equipment that he may or may not have, and it draws further from this aquifer. So after massive numbers, some 20,000 trees were raised just in Cast Lead, and before that in incursions in 2004, and the sort of succession of previous incursions. You have again and again individuals faced with these dilemmas of 10 years of depending upon government agencies or NGOs to feed his family, or planting short-term crops that are ultimately possibly destructive to the collective. So these dilemmas, these situations, and how the different governing bodies active in Gaza, both the Hamas government, the Fatah government, which sort of exists in the shadow, sort of inactive but active government, plus all of the NGOs, plus the UN, all of these the swarm of different governing bodies that compete for, sometimes at cross purposes, sometimes in collaboration, in order to govern this kind of mundane questions like who can dig wells in the Gaza Strip, come up again and again and again and again throughout our research.
Another quick example of this decision, this gamble that farmers and others have to continuously make, is strawberry farmers. In the 1980s, Israel subsidized, encouraged farmers in northern Gaza to plant strawberries, which are, of course, very water-intensive cash crops that were then labeled for export, but labeled as Israeli products. That seemed like the wise thing to do for them. There was a lot of labor in Gaza. The citrus and so forth were competing with Israeli citrus, and so they figured this was a good idea. And it was fine for the farmers at the time because they were making decent money doing this. But then fast forward to 2005 and the disengagement, and then Israel unilaterally closes all of the commercial crossings for months on end, and all of these farmers were put out of their livelihoods, and hundreds of tons of these strawberries were dumped on the local market. And this is exactly what Maggie was talking about earlier, the volatility, the unpredictability of the situation. And again, the farmers had to decide last year and the year before whether they wanted to take this risk again, because the Dutch government had promised that they would lobby the Israeli government to allow these strawberries to be exported, and in the end they succeeded for like one season. So, but again, you have to decide every year, and if you don't make it this year, you won't be able to plant next year because you won't have any income, and it's just this continuous debate. But in the end of the day, I mean, the resilience and the tenacity and the spirit that we saw in farmers like Mohammed Sultan continued to prevail in character after character after character, and the innovation as well.
These guys are, one of the things we try to highlight in the book is just the sense that, like, the borders close, Gazans dig tunnels, the electricity is turned off, people go back and figure out how to rev up the old clay oven that their grandmother had on the rooftop. So there's a sort of constant adaptation to whichever new impossibility arises. People come up with some alternative, and often very enterprising ones. These two gentlemen we stumbled into quite by accident. We were very glad we did, both because it was a total riot just talking to them. It was like a stand-up routine, and we had suddenly like shown up to be the straight man. They were hysterical, and they're brothers, Iyad and Ziad, and they started Gaza's first inland fish farms. Given, as Leila explained, the blockage of the sea and the drastically rising prices of sea fish, even on this stretch of Mediterranean that should be so richly provided with seafood, and the general crisis of protein in Gaza, because one of the less reported aspects, for example, of Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009 was how specifically it targeted the productive industries, factories, but also food generating industries. So of 11 active chicken farms in Gaza, 7 were directly bombed, and the chicks died in almost all the others because it was the middle of winter, fuel was unavailable, electricity was cut off, there was no way to keep them warm. So there are these sort of population crises also of Gazan domestic animals, and then it takes a while to repopulate the strip through the tunnels, bringing fertilized eggs through the tunnels, etc. Everything is complicated. So these gentlemen started a inland fish farm, They don't, of course, have electricity. Gaza is subject to electricity cuts of 8 to 12 hours every day. It was impossible to aerate the tanks, and so they invited all the neighborhood children to come over and splash like crazy in the water to aerate the tanks. Very innovative, very creative, growing tilapia and mullet in these tanks. Of course, most Gazans who have grown up with fresh Mediterranean sea fish found tilapia totally insipid. We can agree with them there, but in a press for protein sources, it's acceptable.
Fish was once one of the major exports of the Gaza Strip, even in the 90s, to Jordan, but even to Israel, because the fish off the port of Haifa was very polluted. So it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about Gaza as an impoverished place, or as a place of you see these kinds of innovations, and to remember that it was once a very rich city of traders, of merchants.
We also talked to really small producers. This, for example, is a Falaha woman who was describing to us how she has one cow, and that the milk from that one cow she uses to make kishik. You may be familiar with kishik. It's a fermented dairy and wheat product traditionally used from times before refrigeration, used to conserve dairy products throughout Central Asia and the Middle East. The Gazan variety of kishik is very peculiar. It uses hot chili peppers and dill in the kishik as it ferments. Anyway, this woman was telling us about the difficulties of keeping her one cow, as grazing land was no longer available. You could import feed, but it's astronomically expensive. You can't predict whether the price you'll get in market for the dairy products will pay for the feed, because the feed prices, again, are totally volatile depending upon whether it has to come through the tunnels or is allowed to come through the Israeli border. So again, even a micro producer like this woman and her one cow are completely subject to the sort of slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I also wanted to show the Zaytun ladies.
Oh, okay. That was in the beginning.
Were they?
I thought you wanted to talk about the
Sorry, we're not very good at PowerPoint, so we have to flip through everything to get to anything. But that way you get nice, pretty vegetables. Are they in the beginning?
Here, I'll find them for you. They're not in the very beginning. I just saw them.
Just talking about instances of creative adaptations to the circumstances. One of the things we noticed a lot were changing gender roles and changing household dynamics. Unemployment in Gaza is massive. When well-intentioned activists claim that Gazans are starving because nothing enters, it's not true, and it's a poor strategy because it's easily dismantled. Any photograph of any store that shows the shelves are full of products from all over the place.
This was the big argument in 2010 when we were there. Just like the op-eds were full of sort of naysayers and others.
What are they complaining about?
There's Snickers bars and chips, salt and sodas on the supermarket shelves. Or they would show the menus from like some of the higher end restaurants in Gaza. Look, there's beef stroganoff. No one's starving. So this was, And how do you then discuss
that the statement is false, but the effect is true? The shelves are stocked. In 2010, the shelves were stocked with everything. That doesn't mean that anyone can actually purchase them. There's a big difference between availability and accessibility. Gaza does have a sort of very small, prosperous class of professionals who work with international agencies and do have the personal economy to buy these products at jacked up prices that have come in through the tunnels. So they're visible and all of these products are available. But that doesn't mean that you are free to choose between 6 varieties of soda pop. Does not mean that you are free to develop an economy, or that you are that this is a functional economy. And so these families who have Gaza, we should note, is not historically a poor place. Gaza has been subject to a very abrupt, very intense, and very deliberate de-development. its infrastructures have been repeatedly destroyed and then have been unable to be repaired because of the blockade, and a very active both subsistence farming tradition, which was dismantled throughout the 80s and into the 90s by encouraging workers to go into Israel as day laborers, whether in the factories or in the fields. Then those lands fell into abandon, were urbanized, or were simply sort of unattended because people were sort of proletarianized in Israel, and then suddenly the borders closed to workers with the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000. So some over 100,000 mostly male workers that relied on going to Israel every day for their, to bring home the bacon, so to speak, not bacon, were suddenly out of work, inactive, and sitting around at home. There have been repeated efforts to create jobs, but really in this tiny little fishbowl of a strip, there's really not that much to do when there's no possibility of export, there's virtually no possibility of importing raw materials. It's simply stuck. So faced with almost universal male unemployment, lots of women have sort of broken traditional gender expectations and become the breadwinners for their families. And this was a women's cooperative we went to in the old town of Gaza City in the Zaytun district. It's a group of maybe 15 women who are all housewives who, faced with this constant and sort of chronic male unemployment, decided what we know how to do is cook, so we're going to set up this cooking cooperative in which they catered for events, catered for wealthy families who would, order in major meals, and it was an impressive setup.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the women we met there, Lulu Sammouni from the sadly well-known Sammouni family who lost 40 members in Kasled. She was working in this small kitchen and supporting not only herself but also her brother and his family's 14 members through the sort of meager income they made here. But it was also a place where they could meet, seek the comfort of the company and be productive. And one of the things she was doing, this woman Lulu, was making the sun-dried maftoul, this Palestinian couscous, and packaging it for local retail sale within Gaza. And she was able, after we met her, to then print labels. She needed some money to print labels on the packages that would say it's Lulu's maftoul. So that's something that she's now doing. So, but again, incredible grace, dignity, resilience that you see time and again. Back to the point, just quickly, we were talking about accessibility versus availability. Just one more thing on that. Again, because I don't know what I just did. Oh, it's really confusing to a lot of people, but just to note that this has been sort of official Israeli policy ever since 2005 and the disengagement, when Israeli advisor Dov Weisglass, who devised the disengagement for Ariel Sharon, had explained the point of the siege on Gaza as the following, as a Gaza diet, to put Palestinians on a diet but not let them starve to death. And the idea there is to let in enough goods to stave off humanitarian crisis, kind of leave them teetering on the edge so that you wouldn't have this big media outcry, but at the same time prevent prosperity, development, so like Maggie was saying, targeting the productive sector of Gaza. And that's exactly what we've seen happening ever since 2005. And in that vein, you see things like factory components, like fertilizers, like books, like computers, all these things are banned from entering, as are people banned from leaving to get an education in the West Bank. There's a categorical ban on the movement of people out of Gaza to the West Bank, to Jerusalem, to Israel. Anyway, but it's important to remember these kinds of policies have resulted in massive food insecurity. And then that's why you see goods might be available, but people then can't access those goods, can't buy these chips or Snicker bars or sodas or whatever. So, just something to keep in mind.
So some 80% of the population depends entirely on food rations distributed to the population that has official refugee status by the UNRWA, which is the UN agency created in 1948 to manage the needs of the Palestinian refugees, initially for a short term, ultimately for 65 years and going strong. And for those who do not have official refugee status, by the World Food Program and a host of other NGOs that do food rations. The problem, of course, being that these food rations are really basic and really minimal. They consist of white wheat flour, sugar, salt, sometimes rice, sometimes not, usually some legume, whether lentils or chickpeas, and cooking oil, which is not olive oil, the traditional Palestinian oil, which is almost completely inaccessible because of the massive destruction of olive trees, and now is used only as the sort of precious drop on a salad by those families that can afford a little bottle.
And also, again, because Gaza is cut off from the West Bank, where most of those trees now grow, no export, no import.
So,
Maggie, would you like to take some?
Yeah,
questions?
sure.
should we take questions?
We're
Okay,
going on
we
and
can
on
go
and
on and on. Please.
Identify yourselves and be brief so that others can have a chance.
Sure. I'm Blake Selzer with CARE. So we are one of these humanitarian organizations working in both.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we talk about in the book is the CARE rabbit rearing projects that were taking place in 2010. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah. So, and we get to the point of talking about we provide humanitarian relief, but we also have been speaking quite loudly and frankly at the underlying causes of poverty and have talked about ending the blockade. So I just put that out there. But at first I'd like to thank you for the book. I think narrating Gazans as human beings is incredibly helpful, especially here in Washington. And it's something that folks should hear. I had the privilege of going to Gaza last fall. And one of the things that struck me, and this relates to the cookbook, I think, was I met with a Gazan fisherman. And it was incredibly powerful for him just to say, look, I used to be able to take my catch in the morning and go into even Jerusalem many years ago, and I just want to provide a livelihood. So I wonder if some of the recipes were fish-based in the past from your book, and now that they don't even do those anymore, because as you mentioned, it's international law to be 20 nautical miles. It was 6, now it's 3 from last week. So I just wonder if, from a recipe perspective, was there a lot of fish recipes in the past that they can't do anymore?
There is, like we said in the beginning, people really seem to do what they can, adapt however they may in order to preserve those traditional recipes, and I think this applies equally to the fish. Certainly now the fish is not affordable to a large segment of the population, but traditional fishing families do continue to use the fish recipes, I would say. I mean, they're not quite the catches they once were. You're not getting, and the sea bass that was once like a staple of Gazan cuisine, lugos, is pretty much not affordable. I mean, except to the higher end families in Gaza. Sardines are widely available, and you'll frequently hear people talking about these small miracles that are occurring, like at the height of the blockade. Suddenly there was this massive, the biggest sardine catch in the history of Gaza, or as long as fishermen could remember. Suddenly the sardines all washed up on shore, and they don't know how. I mean, this was in 2007, I think. Similarly, a couple of months ago, there was like 200 manta rays that washed. I don't know if you read about that. That's somehow washed up on the shores of Gaza, and ray meat is considered a delicacy in Gaza, and it's used. So, somehow, I don't know if it has to do with the deep sea channel or what, like divine intervention or something, but they manage to find fish. But again, they tend to be smaller fish. Maybe the one kind of fish that you don't see as often, we were just discussing this with my father here, because as a child he would consume a lot of shark. There's actually a ban. Israel is one of 5 countries to ban shark fishing, not shark finning. And it also, in addition to banning the collection of za'atar in the hills of the West Bank, or fining people for that, in addition to akub thistles, all of these things are sort of staples of Palestinian food. So,
in general, in terms of people ceasing to make or changing what they were making, what we mostly found is that people were trying to make the same recipes they always did, but with what was available. Right. So instead of using a whole chicken, you use the heads and wings and parts, whatever. Instead of using fresh meat, use frozen in smaller quantities. Instead of using, the optimal fish, you use the little fish or the tilapia or something. But people trying to maintain their food habits, because I think it does mean so much to people in terms of the taste of home and of family, but adapting to the circumstances, making less, more infrequently, with cheaper parts, whatever.
The other thing on the fish is that we found really fascinating is that you find now Palestinian fishermen, going out to the Egyptian Gaza, whatever, nautical border, whatever it's called, and buying fish from the Egyptians. And that's frequently what you'll be eating in Gaza's fish restaurants, or bringing in frozen fish through the tunnels, which is pretty vile, but again, that, you do what you have to do, so, yeah.
More questions? So many. For example, a couple of nights ago, we did a private party. We cooked for a bunch of women near Layla's home, and we did a whole spread of traditional Gazan fish recipes, going back to the seafood. They're extraordinary. They're wonderful recipes.
It's kind of this hidden treasure of Palestinian culinary heritage, because of course, West Bankers no longer have access to the sea, and the other areas are.
It's the last little piece of the Palestinian diaspora, really, that has direct access to the Mediterranean, because others are scattered all over the world, Europe, South America, or Jordan, Lebanon, largely far from the Mediterranean. So this last little piece of Palestine that actually has contact with the sea maintains these recipes. Many of the sort of more elaborate, sophisticated ones are from Jaffa, which was in its day the sort of major cosmopolitan port city with a strong bourgeoisie and very elaborate, very minute food culture.
And much of the inhabitants of the Shaltet refugee camp in Gaza City are from Jaffa and continue to make those dishes. In fact, that's where we got a lot of those recipes from.
So the characteristic tastes of Gazan food that make it perhaps notably and recognizably different from other parts of Palestine tends to be use of a lot of hot chilies, whether green ones or red ones. Also red chilies crushed into a paste and conserved in olive oil that's used widely. It's used, for example, to stuff crabs, or as a marinade sort of for calamari rings, which are then fried. We made the other day a sort of sweet and spicy caramelized calamari and rice dish. Also, zibdiyat gambari is a major favorite.
When we talked about the zibdiyah, we should talk about that.
And we should talk about the zibdiyah.
But yeah, while you're finding that, generally the flavors of Gaza tend to be kind of herby, sour, hot, extensive use of fresh herbs, extensive use of dill in its green form and its seed form, which is something that's sort of very specific to that area. Same with the chilies. We keep getting asked why, it's strange, why do they use so many chilies when nobody else in the region does? And it's kind of one of these culinary mysteries that might have had something to do with Gaza's position as a crossroads, and it's being a major, one time, the main port to the Mediterranean, but in the end, who knows? But these are the flavors, kind of herby, peppery, sour. She mentions zibdiyat gambari. This is kind of the dish, shrimps in a clay pot is the translation. And it's kind of this dish that anyone who has been to Gaza, any foreigner who has returned, requests. Like the first thing they request, they might have eaten in a restaurant. I don't know if you ever had the chance of trying it when you went. But anyway.
If you go back, you should.
Yeah, but anyway, it's made in this vessel, which we forgot to talk. We usually bring it with us, but we forgot, which we kind of refer to as the soul of Gazan cuisine. It's called a zibdiyah, and it's crafted from the red clay of Gaza, and this is a lemon wood pestle that comes with it. And it's kind of an all-in-one device. It's used to crush garlic, but also to prepare salad. It's also used as a serving bowl to serve the salad. It's also used as a baking device to bake the shrimps in and the stews, and they come in different sizes. And every household, poor, rich, whatever, urban, peasant, will have one of these, and they're sort of considered members of the family and referred to very proudly, and people will have them for decades. And you can't
almost every culture has a mortar and pestle and uses a mortar and pestle for something. But I have never seen anywhere such intensive, exhaustive, and almost universal use of this zibdiyah. And you'll find, if you look through our book, almost every single recipe begins with crush vigorously, but really crush vigorously, whether that's garlic or spices to bring out the perfume or whatever. More questions?
Any other questions? Sure.
name is Sam Chappell-Sokol. I study culinary diplomacy. So this is fascinating
Really?
talk.
I didn't know you could study that. How great.
Neither did I. Apparently you can.
I'm wondering if you two are interested or willing or are planning on marketing this book in Israel.
We just had a 4-page spread in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, came out last week, and we're sort of amazed at how much interest it's generating in Israel, and with
The Forward also did a really extensive interview. We also just did we just had a sort of a discussion that's going to be published in Bon Appetit with Yotam Ottolenghi, co-author of Jerusalem. So there seems to be a lot of interest. But at the same time, we make very clear that we kind of reject this notion of what we call hummus kumbaya. So that's not what our book is about. It's, like we said, it's narrating the human story of Gaza. It's providing the Palestinians of Gaza an image of themselves that they recognize. It's sort of correcting the representation of Gaza. And it's starting a conversation, but it's, you can't talk about, right, I was just saying, you can't talk about, food as coexistence while ignoring everything else, the context, right? When someone's rights are being trampled on, you can't you just say, well, let's just share this bowl of hummus, everything will be okay. So, but anyway, but there has been a lot of interest, yes.
We are really interested in sharing it and discussing it and generating a conversation, but not a critical one. And one of the concerns we've had, and people have voiced it to us, and we discuss it in the book, is about cultural appropriation. And already it's such a sort of painful subject for many Palestinians to see one after another Palestinian traditional food then reach the shelves in the United States marketed as an Israeli food product. And people have expressed concern to us that, like, no, now you're not only going to give them like the street foods like hummus, falafel, but also intimate home foods. You're going to,
which have traditionally really been in the realm of the private, generally across the Middle East, not just in Palestine. But.
And our hope, and we recognize that ambivalence, and but we feel like our sort of wager is sharing, discussing, opening a conversation, always in a critical way, never in this sort of hummus kumbaya tone, is a possibility for dialogue, and is a possibility for highlighting and bringing attention to some of the structural inequalities that exist. So we'll see, but that's a long answer. The short answer is yes.
One more question.
Hi, thank you. I'm really excited. I'm excited to start cooking. And I want to know actually about an Arabic version of the book. And because I think Gaza is just as foreign, I think, among Palestinians, I should say, in the diaspora, and then also in the Arab world. And then are there plans for a tour maybe in the Middle East?
Sure,
in the Arab world, maybe among refugees.
Sure, if you want to set it up for us, we're more than happy. No, I mean, definitely we're open. We're trying to now, we're in the process of working with locating an Arabic publishing house to translate it and publish it in Arabic, but also definitely touring the Middle East. It's always a matter of setting up the venues and making contact with the people. And so we have a lot of sort of celebrity chefs on Arab satellite have already expressed interest in the book, the Fatafit Food Channel, and Chef Ramzi and Chef Hussam and all these people. So we're kind of using that as our starting point, and hopefully something will come of it.
But we are actively seeking international editions of this book. So if anybody has contacts with international publishers doing translations of this kind of book, we really welcome those contacts. We are sort of looking for them right now.
Layla and Maggie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We learned a lot about Gaza through hearing you talk about food, and vice versa. So you are very enterprising, and maybe next year there'll be a Gaza restaurant.